Okay, so at the end of the last time, our last session, you mentioned your first flirting class. Not that you need to start there, but I thought you had said that you'd mentioned this to Richard, that you were going to do this, and then he had some advice or some reaction.
Mm-hmm.
So you can start there if you like.
Well,
Or we
first
can
of
leave
all,
him out and you can just talk about the class.
first of all, I was divorced in 1976, and I had just started my practice as a therapist, and one of the things that female clients asked me all the time was, where do you go to meet men? And I didn't know. And around over the next year or two, a lot of people started to get divorced. Say in the late 70s, and I think it really peaked around 1980 or 81, within that 10-year period. And I used to say it was during that period that more women were leaving their husbands than before, where husbands had been leaving their wives. So the United Methodist Church had a singles club. They were in Canal Street, and they hired me to do a workshop for singles. And I entitled the workshop, How to Meet People. Now this was 1978, somewhere in there. And I had little topics during the day. And the one after lunch was entitled Flirting 101. And consistently people would say to me, let's skip all the stuff in the morning and go right to the Flirting 101. So here I am, I'm doing this in 1977, 78, which coincides with the time that I met Richard Bandler, that he presented in May 77 at Louisiana Group Psychotherapy Conference in New Orleans. And so one of the times that Richard's in town, I mentioned to him that I'm doing flirting classes, and I don't call them flirting classes. I call them workshops for singles, and he's really interested in the idea. And he keeps trying to get me to change the name from How to Meet People to the flirting class, because I keep referring to it as a flirting class.
Oh.
And I say to him, I can't advertise a flirting class. I have a serious psychotherapy practice. And he would say, well, maybe that's the problem. It's a serious practice. Maybe it ought to lighten up a little bit. And
You didn't want to be that therapist who does nothing but flirting classes.
well, I'll tell you exactly. I wanted to be serious. But I realized as I explored it more, one day I woke up and I thought, the reason that I had moved the name, instead of calling it flirting class, I had called it, sort of inched over a little bit, and I called it flirting or just being friendly. And the reason I did that is because I was starting to realize that when I had been married, Johnny had accused me of flirting, and I had always said, no, I'm just being friendly, which is what I was doing. I was just being friendly. I had used Barbara's techniques of just being friendly to everybody. And so I was really defensive about being accused of being flirting, and one morning I woke up and I realized that that was the resistance to calling it a flirting class. And I called George Hay, who was my first therapist and teacher, and I said, George, I found the reason. And he said, well, what is it? And I said, I don't want Johnny to hear about it and say, Sam was right. So once I realized that, I let it go, and I considered calling it the flirting class, but what really prompted me to do it, Richard told me one time, he said, it's such a good idea that if you don't do it, I will. And in that same period of time, I think a book came out, Changing Your Mind and Keeping the Change, but it was one of his books. And in the book, he's quoted as saying that he knew a gal who was teaching flirting classes, and he dropped the line into the NLP community. And the minute I read it in the book, I thought, well, it was just the final shove that I needed. Mm-hmm. So I started advertising the flirting class. Well, it was instantaneous. Channel 4, Channel 8, it sent film crews out. I did a flirting class. I did a charm school. I continued to do how to meet people. But the flirting class is the one that got the attention. Newspaper columnist interviewed me. I was interviewed for a book in New York. In fact, I gave the gal the title in the interview. I said to her, well, all the good men are not taken. And she actually used that as a title for her book. But she quotes what I say as the flirting expert. And to this day, people still say to me, you're the flirting expert. And when a lot of times people will say to me, well, are you flirting with me in a social situation or whatever? And my line is, what, for free? So, anyhow, that's the story of the flirting class. And Richard indeed did like the idea so much that in 1983, we did it sort of off-Broadway in Seattle. We did a flirting class. And that's a funny story, too.
Yeah, it must have been fun, yeah.
Well, that's a funny story, too, because the day before I got on the flight to go to Seattle, I went outside to work in my garden, which I like to do. And that night, I had these bright red streaks. I don't know if it was poison oak or poison ivy, all over my arms and my chest, because I had been in a little, spaghetti strap top and everything. And I thought, oh my God, I'm going to do a flirting class and look like I have some wild disease. And so I found a white shirt that I had. It was sort of one of the high collars or button over. It was pretty. It kind of had a lace thing, but it had long sleeve. And I wore it. And that Friday night, when I got there, and we started, because we did a Friday night and an all-day Saturday. And the first thing Richard said to me when he saw me is, what are you doing dressed like a nun while we're doing a flirting class? And I said, Richard, I have poison oak or something. I have these bright red streaks all over me. So that evening after the class was over, we're sitting in his room, and I show him, I open the thing and I show him, and it's terrible looking. And he says to me, he said, it just so happens, he said, that I have this little salve, and he takes out something about that size, and it's a little container, and he opens it up, and it's this little yellow salve, and he said, my Chinese doctor gave it to me, and he said, it's good for irritation stuff. So he puts a little on me, and so it feels good. And so I take my top off and I rub it on my sleeves, and just on my shoulders and everything. And so we're sitting there. I'm not thinking anything of it, and we're talking or watching TV, and I have to go to the bathroom. It's maybe half an hour later. I have to go to the bathroom. We're in the hotel in Seattle, and so I walk into the bathroom, and these hotel bathrooms have a whole wall of mirrors, and so I walk in, and out of the corner of my eye, I see myself. Now, this is because I really didn't want to look at it before, and I see myself, and I don't see it, and I turn around and look, and it's all gone. And I can't believe it. It's all gone. I said, Richard, it's all gone. It's all gone. It's gone. He said, I know. He said, I've been sitting there talking to you. I know it's gone. And I said, how did that happen? Now, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm sitting here hoping he doesn't tell you the truth, because then it might come back.
Right. I don't know to this day if he convinced me it was this little magic stuff that this Chinese doctor gave him, or if I'm dealing with one of the world's best hypnotists. And there are recorded incidences of people having just that. Mm-hmm. They have an allergy in one state, and hypnotized, the allergy goes away. And it went away. And it didn't come back the rest of the week, and it was gone. So, what can you say? So we went ahead and did the workshop. He said to me, I think it was that weekend, he said, did you bring your list? Because I had written a list of flirting behaviors. Any two of them that you use will constitute flirting. I used to teach people to stand in a, straight arms at your side, what I call the soldier position, and then to turn their head and look over their shoulder, look at somebody over their shoulder, and then maybe put one arm on the side. I'm trying to get, it's like an irregular or asymmetrical, any two of them, or then I would, have them start at the toes and look up. I mean, it was a very specific set of body behaviors, facial expressions, etc. to do. And I said, oh no, I forgot the list. And he said, well, what are we going to do? And I said, well, I'll just make up some more. So I wrote down a list of, it was actually 64. And so we did the off-Broadway flirting class, which is actually where I met Roy Frazier. He was in Seattle. It was an NLP workshop. And then we went to Palm Springs in May of 1983. This is during Richard's trial. We filmed it during the trial. He wanted to make the film as a fundraiser to raise the money to pay Jerry Schwarzenberg, the attorney, for the trial. So I went there, and Richard said, whatever the immediate sales of the flirting tape are, he says, I'll take and use to pay Jerry. He said, and after that, he said, you can sell it yourself and make all the money you want, which is exactly what happened. He sold it. People, I suppose people bought a lot of them because it became so well known that a lot of the NLP trainers started doing flirting classes. I mean, it went like a craze. But actually, when you think back, I pioneered it in 1978. Nobody else was doing it, and we made the art of flirtation. I wish I could remember. Paul, can't remember his name. It was a first-rate producer. He filmed it in Palm Springs, and
The film must be floating around in somebody's seminar from year after year, teaching students.
Right. Well, it was a VHS, an hour and a half color VHS. I now have transposed it to DVD.
You have a copy. Great.
Oh, yeah. Well, I sell it all over my website. I have a website that sells it, and I sell it on my website.
And you illustrate the 64 strategy?
No, I don't illustrate that. That's not, but I'll, even as I'm thinking about it, I should make a copy and enclose it with the DVD. Because the DVD of Richard and I doing the flirting class, he's holding the list. Have you ever seen it? Have you ever seen? Oh, I'm going to get you a copy.
I took a flirting workshop with you, but you never mentioned 64 strategies, or I just don't remember them. They were probably in the back of your head. And
we talk about
and you probably don't use all 64 in one workshop anyway.
No, but I talk about them in the flirting DVD. But I'll get you a little DVD, and I'll get you a copy of the 64. In fact, I should start enclosing it with
the list.
The list. Huh. But it was an instant hit, and for years, maybe even now, I could call any NLP center anywhere in the world. It was the weirdest thing, and say, "Hello, my name is," and they'd say, "Oh, and they'd recognize my voice. They knew. It made it. It gave me instant recognition in the NLP community.
Well, you certainly don't need any reassurance about being the, I don't know how to put it, the flirting therapist. Because I've never heard that used about you from anybody, in the community who knew you. They didn't say, "Oh, she's the one who does flirting, huh?" As if there's all she can do.
Oh, right.
No one's ever used that.
Right, but it was enough to stop me. Richard wanted me, he had a publishing company, Meta Publications, and he wanted me to write a book on flirting. And I signed a contract. And never wrote the book on flirting because I started researching attraction patterns. And then I got really interested because I was doing workshops on attraction patterns, mostly for this book, to see why people were attracted to the ones that they were, or why some people were attracted to people who weren't attracted to them, or who weren't available, or some people would flirt with somebody who was looking at them and smiling, and other people would reject that person and flirt with somebody who was a challenge, who was ignoring them. It made no sense at all. And so I started exploring it, and as I explored it, I got much more interested in not just the attraction patterns, but the selection and rejection patterns. Why people would flirt or start a relationship with somebody, and then at a certain stage or after a certain number of days or weeks they'd lose interest, or their relationship would change if they started having sex, so their relationship definitely would change if they moved in together, and definitely dramatically when they got married, and dramatically again when they became parents. And I had just started to move my focus from the attraction to the selection pattern, and I developed, I think I told you about this it's a family of origin inquiry, and I called it the selection test. Well, I got so interested in that I wrote the book Why We Pick the Mates We Do, instead of writing the book on flirting. And somewhere in my files I have a book 3/4 finished on flirting. And I probably would name it flirting or just being friendly.
Oh.
Because the skills were very much the same. And Barbara, who is actually my cousin, but I refer to her as my sister because she's a year older, and we spent our first 16 years together, and we shared a room. And Barbara was, I think, a flirt. She was just being friendly. That's literally what she did. But she was, she taught me. And she taught me well. I just did what Barbara told me to do. In fact, I would have different names for moves in the flirting class. And one or two of them were referred to as the Barbara. They were Barbara's approach, particularly the one where you look at somebody, the feet, and then you look all the way up, and then you look back down again. I mean, it was just what Barbara did. You know, Barbara was always, we used to call her the welcome wagon. She would walk into a room, and she would introduce herself to everybody. It was just, she was just friendly. She wasn't shy. And she would make everybody that she met feel like they were really special.
But she was self-conscious enough about this, self-aware,
No, she was,
that she named it, though.
No, I named it.
You named it.
I named it. Because I tried to emulate her. I named it. But she was friendly. She didn't have any shyness or hesitancy about going over to people. And, you know, I continually would teach people that shy is a first person word. People don't attribute it to other people. They're aware of themselves as shy. But they don't think that somebody else is. They're likely to think someone who isn't paying attention to them isn't friendly, or is aloof, or bored, or not interested, or worse yet, rude, or rejecting them. But it doesn't even occur to them that that person might be shy. Mm-hmm. And, you know, if you start to think that maybe that other person is shy, then you have to be the one to go over and make the first approach. And instead of waiting for someone to come over and approach you. So there were different things that I taught. I would always teach gals to go over and introduce themselves to men, rather than wait for the man to come over and introduce. And I still say to this day, the best men are the ones that you have to go over and sit next to and start a conversation with. The ones you want to watch out for are the ones who come over and introduce themselves to you and have these great lines, the smooth talkers, because they'll say that to everybody. And so I would teach very specific techniques. It was a class. I would line the men up on one side and the gals on the other, and then I would have them do different postures. You know, and which posture is most likely to catch a man's eye? Which one is most likely to catch a female's eye? And the one that wins, hands down, would catch a female's eye is a guy sort of in the door, leaning a little bit against the door jamb, maybe with one hand or two hands in his pocket, or maybe even with his arm closed and his head tilted. That's a winner. That's a guarantee.
That's an attraction pattern.
That's an attraction pattern. That works.
And the reverse?
And the reverse was a woman who would be standing, of course you can't stand, but standing straight, maybe one hand on a hip, and just a little, you know, not standing straight up, and smiling. Mm-hmm. I mean, someone who looks approachable is definitely better than someone who's not smiling, or someone who's looking away. I would caution people, if you're interested in somebody, even though you may get nervous, most people can't tolerate their own excitement. So if they see somebody that they're interested in, or that person's interested in them, rather than look embarrassed or flustered, they're likely to turn away, sometimes even turn their back on that person to recover their composure. And they'll walk away. They don't realize they've turned their back, and that the signal that they're sending is, I'm not interested. And, or someone is likely, if someone's attracted to you and you're standing next to another guy that they're not attracted to, they're likely to go over and talk to that guy because he doesn't make them nervous.
Right.
And so it's a mixed signal. So you would get the signal that, oh, well, she's not interested in me, when indeed she is. It's a really... People, I can understand why people don't meet the person that they want. Because gals, for instance, or guys too, who won't approach someone that they're interested, are only going to meet the people who approach them. And the people who approach them may not include the one that they're attracted to.
I've noticed once in the past that sometimes couples attended your flirting workshop. What do you think's going on there? I mean, some of them were married already, or some of them were couples for a long time.
Yeah, that's
Why would
fun.
a couple go to a flirting workshop?
Just to add a little spark to their relationship. I tell them to go to a party, but go in separately. And, one go in one corner of the room and one go to the other. Every once in a while to look over at each other and look back. What I call the returning glance. And look over. And then somewhere, don't walk over, just, somewhere there, just sort of wink or smile. And then either one, just to go like that, just to play with each other a little bit, I mean, it's still... I'll walk in somewhere or meet Dan, or he'll meet me somewhere, and he's likely to turn to me and go, oh, do you come here often? And I'll say, well, I will from now on. It's just a little flirting that it's just fun. That's fun.
I don't remember whether this movie was a remake of Days of Wine and Roses. But a few years, do you remember that movie, Days of Wine and Roses?
Jack Lemmon.
Yeah, but there was a movie a few years ago with, I think it was Andy Garcia and Meg Ryan. And it opens with, he's sitting at a bar, and in walks this young woman, and they strike up a conversation. And I suppose you might call that episode 1. By the end of the episode, she's sitting on his lap at the bar, face to face, and they're making out. As the movie continues, we learn that they are a couple.
Of course.
I think married. And,
of course.
But
and they're shocking.
Right.
They're doing some shocking behavior.
Right.
Exactly.
So it really catches one's attention.
Right. I was at my son's Halloween party the other night, and one of the family, I guess, moments, and I turned to Debbie and I said, oh, it's too bad Billy and Nikki aren't here. And right away, she knows what we're talking about, because he was sitting there, and, this was 2 Halloweens ago, and she just walked up and sat on his lap, straddled him and sat on his lap, and they started kissing, and everybody's turning around and looking, and we're keeping an eye on them just to see if they don't get totally out of hand. But this is how they behave, and it just added that little, flair, like, we'll do these 2. And I'd walk by them and go, do you 2 know each other? But, yeah.
Well, it probably adds a spice to the evening that others in the room won't even admit to.
And we won't admit to, whether they're shocked or whether they laughed, or there were a wide range of reactions. But, yeah, they, I don't know if we call it, that's way past flirting. That was my definition. When people say, well, what is flirting? I would say, somewhere after being friendly, but right before making a pass, is an area called flirting. And it's sort of a meeting and getting to know, but a very playful encounter. And I always encourage people, unlike what most people would say, which was, well, what do you do? Where do you work? Well, it's not an interview. If you're going to hire this person, we'll ask that. But if you're flirting, well, what do you like to do? Where do you go in this town? Or, you play tennis? Or what you're searching for is something that you all like to do together, a common interest, or a place that you may say, oh, I'm usually going. I might say, oh, well, I've never been there. Maybe I could go with you sometime. I mean, those are the sort of connections that people make with each other. I've encouraged people always to ask for a phone number. Guys particularly, when they ask for a phone number, as they're asking, give the gal their phone number. Because a gal is less likely to say no if you indeed have given her your phone number. And they're just little things that over the years have worked. Most people, if they get a phone number, most guys or even gals aren't going to call them. Just 60% will not call. They get nervous. I used to say the 6-digit dial, where you start to dial somebody's phone number, and you don't dial the last digit, you just hang up. You get nervous. One of the best flirting lines, and I don't like flirting lines. I always encourage people, do not use a line. If it's very good, it might get a laugh, but it's going to backfire, because the person is either going to get intimidated or think you're not serious or you're too good at this. I would always say just to walk over and say, hi, my name is Ann, what's yours? Or the other one I like is, well, are you friendly? I, came here all by myself and I don't know anybody. Can I stand next to you or can I talk to you? That works consistently. But I can remember the best flirting line I've ever heard. I was at a parade, the St. Patrick's Day parade, which goes down Metairie Road. And I was in front of my office, and I think my Doug and Billy were with me. They were teenagers, and it was just the three of us and maybe some other people in the family, and I was standing kind of maybe 2 or 3 people deep in the crowd, and this guy walks along, and he stops, and he's marching, and he stops, and he looks at me, and he points right at me, and he comes through the crowd, and he has, they have the green paper carnations, and he hands me one, and he says, are you married, engaged, or with a guy who's a lot bigger than I am? And I laughed, and I said, no, no, no. And he said, oh, good. He reaches in his pocket, and he takes out his card, and he said, I would take your number. He said, but I've been drinking beer since this parade started. And he said, let me give you my card. Will you call me? And he gave me his card. And I said, sure. Well, I didn't that day, and I didn't the next day. But then following day, I did. I called him, and he said, "I'm so glad you called." He said, "I don't remember anything else about that parade, but I do remember meeting this great gal, and I'm so glad you called." And it was just a really good connection. But most people won't call. You know, to this day, if somebody flirts with you or you or you or you or me, I always think you don't have to be, you know, responsive in the way that, oh yeah, I'm interested. I mean, I'm in a relationship, but I still say, well, thank you, that's really nice. That's all you have to say. It's just acknowledge someone's attention. That's really what flirting is. It's a playful attention.
You think divorce is the opposite end of that continuum? Flirting at one end and divorce at the other?
That's an interesting, yeah, flirting being the very beginning in the attraction stage and divorce being the absolute end. Yeah, I never thought about it that way. And part of it may be that they're getting a divorce because they stop paying positive attention to each other. Or they stop being fun for each other. Or, you know, for some people the mystery's gone, the excitement's gone. I don't think that the excitement's gone when you know somebody really well. I think that that adds to the excitement. But a lot of people, you know, I guess, I don't know, maybe they like the challenge. There are people who do new relationship, because they like that first stage. I think it's referred to as the honeymoon stage. They like the honeymoon stage of or they like the challenge stage. You know, the catch, and release stage. That the minute they get someone and they get the person interested, then the challenge is over, so they'll move on. They're different types in the attraction stage. The very best is, you know, in the old days, people would say, well, what's your sun sign? That was the number one question people would ask. Now, the number one question is, you know, did your mother and father have a good marriage? If your mother and father had a good marriage, that is the number one criteria.
But now, good here can also mean they never divorced, right? Even if they
It means they never divorced, but they got along well enough to teach you some commitment skills. You know, that they stayed married and they got along well enough. Doesn't have to be on a scale of 0 to 10. Doesn't have to be an 11.
Right.
You know, but they could teach you some skills. If somebody says, oh, my father hated my mother, or, you know, I don't know, my father left my mother before I was born, watch out. Watch out. You know, in the old days when families picked the husband or the wife, and they picked someone from a good family.
Right.
That's what they're talking about.
Important, yes.
And the good family is somebody who had parents who had a good relationship. It wasn't just that they had money or social status, that, you know, they got along.
Right.
Because those are a set of imprinted skills that you learned. I mean, your mother and father didn't divorce. And you didn't divorce.
Right.
Linda's mother and father didn't divorce. And you didn't divorce. Right. You know.
And when her father's mother died, his father married his first wife's sister.
That was typical.
So that was typical in the mountains.
That was very typical.
And certainly a history, a family story of stability.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They took care of the brother's wife and the brother's children, and they stayed in the marriage. Yeah, definitely.
It took me a number of years to really understand arranged marriage in other cultures, but I finally got it because with us it's romantic love first.
Which is a mistake.
But in these arranged marriage cultures, they marry for status, family type to family type, social class to social class. It's not often crossed at all, these social classes.
But it's interesting.
But they married for status and responsibility. And love comes because you respect someone for being a responsible partner.
Yeah, and if you have sex regularly with somebody, you do form a bond.
Right.
Then you have children, and you have property. Bonds do form. But I did my psychogenetic workshop in Mexico, and I didn't expect that it would hold true in Mexico. That, if I'm like my father's personality, I'm going to pick somebody like my mother. Or because I come from a set of opposites, and my parents were a set of opposites. My first marriage was to an opposite. The next relationship that I had was with somebody who was very much like my husband, and it was an opposite. I finally learned that if I change my imprint and I pick somebody who's more alike me, that I'm like my father, and I pick somebody who's like my father's personality, that re-imprinting shift to be with somebody who we're more alike is a better move. But when I was going to talk about Mexico, when I did the workshop in Mexico, I thought, because a lot of those marriages, they weren't arranged, but they were more family motivated.
Clan, tribe, something like that.
Yeah, that my selection test or psychogenetic profile wouldn't hold true, but it did. It held true because parents picked the child of another couple who they were like. So it was the same thing. I mean, the reason that people pick the mate that they do. If I'm like my father, I would be attracted to someone like my mother. That's in my DNA. One like this and one like that. And the same was the second reason is because the parental couples are alike. And I picked somebody who came from somewhat the same relationship school. When I married Johnny, his father's personality was like my father's personality. His mother's personality was like my mother's personality. He had also come from a set of opposites. Johnny and I were a set of opposites.
But I think I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was like my father and his father, and he was like my mother's personality and his mother's personality.
But I think you're suggesting, even if there's a problem in a marriage and they divorce, that even if you shift the imprinting, you still connect yourself with somebody who has an opposite trait. Until
you go through the re-imprinting process that I recommend in psychogenetics. That's a little more difficult to explain, but I imagine, that's why I call it the Star Trek model, where I boldly, in my imagination and in role play and practice, I boldly take my parents further than they were able to get on their own. In other words, my parents got along well, certainly well enough. They were a team, but there were some areas that they didn't. But using a chair for my father, a chair for my mother, role played them, getting along a lot better and being more alike instead of opposite in some ways, because they worked in their marriage because they were opposites. They made a success of it, but in their later years, long after I was out of the house, and long after my imprinting, which occurred in the first 10 years, was over, they were very much alike. They worked to a point where they were very much alike, and they got along wonderfully. Had they worked to get, had they had that when I was a young child, I would have seen that earlier. It's a very interesting process. My imprinting would have been not from them working it out, but it would have been it was already worked out. Because what I duplicated in my marriage was the relationship that I saw with my mother and father in the first 10 years of my life. And Johnny and I worked it out. We were opposites. We worked it out for, 19 years. My mother and father were married for 26 years when my father died. My mother never dated anyone after that. And she was only 52 years old when my father died. She never dated. In fact, none of the females in my marriage, in my family, have ever remarried. Or, in fact, didn't even date or remarry after their husbands died, or married, or who was divorced. None of them ever did. And that was one of the things that I had to work through, because I certainly wanted to date and be in a relationship and maybe even remarry. But it's not in my imprint to do that.
Right, you haven't.
I haven't.
You dated, but you've not
I've
remarried
dated
yet.
and I've been in relationships,
Right.
but I haven't remarried. And so I wonder, if that would be the great re-imprinting, is to dare to do that.
Well, that's what I'm trying to put my finger on at the moment, the re-imprinting. If you re-imprint with the help of a therapist or whatever, then that means next time around you don't pair up with the same person as before.
That's actually true. I haven't.
Okay, but that means, let's say the first person was your opposite. Okay, so you separate, you get a divorce, you go through re-imprinting. No, you go through re-imprinting. That's where I want to go now.
Okay.
That means the next pairing is going to be with somebody who is opposite from your first.
That's absolutely true.
But do you change? Are you more like the second one?
I'll tell you.
Or more like?
I'll tell you.
Or do you shift?
I'm in a relationship with Dan, who
Right.
is certainly much more like my father. He's like his father, but he's much more like my father. And that's my primary role model. That's the one that I'm, what I call my inner adult. I'm much more like my father's personality. And so I've changed my imprinting now to be attracted to somebody that I'm alike, to be in a relationship with a set of alikes rather than a set of opposites. And so I'm in a relationship with him, and under stress and under pressure, I probably act more like my mother. But basically, most of the time we get along really well, like my father did. My father was the original peacemaker. I've still said to this day, I heard my father raise his voice 3 times in my entire life. First time the house was on fire, and I didn't even recognize who's that man running through the house screaming. I never heard my father scream.
I guess I'm wondering whether the presence of the opposite ever disappears. And I don't hear you saying that definitively. That's why I'm trying to set up my question.
It does.
You think it does?
I think it does. The only time he doesn't ever change. He's always like my father was.
All right.
I'm the one that every once in a while I just get pissed. And I just, like my mother did. Fortunately, I'm with somebody who had an Irish mother who really had a temper. So it's a match. Most of the time she was an easygoing and everything, but I just happened to have lucked into somebody who's a match. My mother had a temper. So if one of us is going to lose it, it's going to be me. And I'm going to get mad. And 15 minutes later, it's all over. I'm not going to stay mad. My mother used to stay mad. That she wouldn't talk to you or she wouldn't look at teach you something. I don't do that. Fortunately, I've had enough therapy that some of it has fixed some of the problems.
What do you think about interviewing? I used to say this as a joke. Incidentally, I think Linda and I are much more alike now, so you're right about that.
Yes.
The longer we stay together. But I remember years ago when I was feeling frustrated, this wasn't always her fault, it was, my pattern too, but I would joke and I would say, oh, I should have interviewed you. It became kind of a joke. But I'm sitting here thinking now about interviewing. What do you think about teaching that along with a flirting class or a separate class?
Well, that's true.
You think there's enough information there to teach the art of interviewing?
That's a
Your
good title.
Future intended.
That is a very good title. How to interview, and there are books written about that. How to, in 4 easy times. But I think that's good. I think the first interview question is certainly, how did your parents get along? Mm-hmm. What do you remember about your parents' relationship in the first 10 years of your life? That's a brilliant question. And, did your father and mother like each other?
What time do you go to bed?
Well, yeah.
Some people stay up all night.
Were they a set of opposites or a set of alikes?
Right.
Because when I wrote my book, I remember this so well, why we picked the mace we do. Was about to go to print. And a therapist friend of mine called and told me, you better stop the press right now. She said, because all of your case studies are couples who were opposites. All of them. And she said, that's not a good database. Did you have any case studies with couples who are alike, or who had parents who were alike? They all had parents who were opposites. And I remember taking all my file folders, and I had them all over the floor, the ones I hadn't even used, and in my file drawers. And 2 o'clock in the morning, I got it. Duh. I'm a couple therapist, and I don't have any couples who are alike. They don't come to therapy.
I was about to say that.
Why not? Because they're alike. They get along. It was the most astounding revelation. All of the couples I had were couples who were opposite. They may have been madly attracted to each other in the beginning because they were fascinated, because they were so different. It was a challenge, whatever you want to call it. That was cute and fun until they had to live day to day with each other. But couples who are opposites will have more problems getting along than couples who are alike. I mean, just the ordinary, everyday things that happen in life, or decisions about lifestyle, or whatever it is, to the degree that they're opposite, the more that they're opposite, the more problems they're going to have. And when I realized that, I just started advising people to interview. Just what you're saying, and I think about it as a book on how to interview, but if you meet somebody, ask about their imprinting. Do it before you start flirting with them or getting cozy, because, sex is super glue. Don't do it after you've had sex. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I notice is that people who want to or will either find somebody that they want to be in a relationship with. They want this person. And whether or not this person wants the same thing they want, but they're fixated on this person. So in order to be in a relationship with this person, they may have to put up with or take whatever it is this person brings to the, brings to the bed. And they'll have difficulty adjusting to the fact that this person wants another kind of relationship than they did. But their primary goal was to have this person. So now they have to put up with or work out the relationship. And then there are people who have a particular relationship that they want. And they search for somebody who will fit into that. And somebody who wants that kind of relationship. Those do much, much better. And then there are the fortunate ones who want this person. And this person also wants the same type of relationship that they want. Those are the success stories. But interviewing is a great idea. You interview somebody for a job. You check their references. You get their work history. The second question is, well, what kind of relationships have you had? What's your history of relationships? Have you been married 3 times for a year each?
That's probably an easy question.
Yeah, let's see.
That is, have you been married 3 times? But the others are probably difficult.
Like what would you suggest?
Well, it would be for me like, what kind of relationships have you had? I couldn't ask someone that question. That's sort of like asking a prostitute, how long have you been doing this? Why do you do this? How did you get into this? You know what I mean?
Right, exactly.
I wouldn't ask those questions either of someone who might be a client of mine who's a prostitute. I wouldn't do that.
I would.
Okay, well, what I'm not saying is if I were her client, I wouldn't ask her that question.
Oh, yeah, that's a little bit different.
That's what I'm avoiding saying.
Right, okay. But I think people
But
need to interview.
interviewing could be commingled with flirting. It might work.
Of course. Yeah. If I love to play tennis, I might say, well, do you play tennis? If you say, no, I hate tennis and I hate anybody who does play tennis. My last girlfriend played tennis and that's all she wanted to do. And we used to fight all the time about her playing tennis. Well, that's valuable information for me. If I have a long, long history of playing tennis and I'm on teams and I like to do this and which I don't, but why would I want to get involved with somebody who's every time I would go to play tennis, I'd have a fight in my hands?
Sports is a good example because lots of men, once they're married, even before actually, will sit on that sofa for all football season and basketball season and baseball season. And watch those games.
And watch them.
And the wife gets all upset. The girlfriend doesn't because she's got a different facade on, a different mask.
Yeah, well,
She needs to pay attention to that.
That's a good example, I've never cared anything about football. Never. I like that the Saints won and that they're winning, but then everybody in New Orleans likes that now. But I've never really cared about football. And when I was married, my husband and all my boys used to watch football, and what I loved about football was that it was 3 or 4 hours that I had completely to myself. That's what I always liked about it. And, I have friends, gals, who like to go to Saints games. Fortunately, I'm not with somebody who is a Saints fan, and I mean fortunately, because I probably wouldn't go. I don't want to go to football games. I'd use those 3 or 4 hours to do something myself. Now, if it was real important to him that I go, and then those are the sort of lifestyle arguments that people have. But the more that people like to do the same thing, the easier it is for them to get along. Work schedule's another thing. I have a couple clients right now. She works the night shift. She leaves the house at 6:15 to get to work for 7 o'clock. And he comes home at 5:15. They have an hour together? And then when she's sleeping, he's awake. It's like, how can they possibly have a relationship? Why are they in therapy? Well, because they don't have enough time together. They manage to have 1 hour a week together because they come to a therapy session. But if either one of them would change their schedule, maybe their relationship would get better, or maybe it would explode, because maybe their lack of time together is what's saving it. I don't know.
This is a good place to stop.
Okay.